Hi there. I'm making this video and I'm going to try to make it moderately in length. I know I say that for many of my videos. Um, I don't know what happened there. My screen just went off for a second. Um, I say that for all of my videos that I try to keep it short and I maybe never succeed, but we'll try again. I want to make this video for a review for the exam. There's obviously a lot of material. A lot of it might be new to you that we've covered in this first unit, these first 5 chapters. And so the purpose of this review is to provide something of a broad overview of the material, kind of a top-down view of the material. A lot of the stuff that we've covered in these first 5 chapters is really meant to kind of tell a story of sorts about different ideas about uh, human knowledge, right? And where knowledge comes from, and seem to be a common theme of whether we can trust the senses. But first off, we might ask the question, why uh, did people adopt those views? And this is why we were also talking about some of the different metaphysical views, because it's those differences that might lead different thinkers to either decide that they do not trust the senses, or maybe that they do trust the senses. And it's that choice that then influences theories of human knowledge. And if you do trust the senses and you want to talk about learning knowledge coming from the senses, knowledge acquired through learning, that also motivates a lot of the early versions of psychological theories that we have seen. And that comes, of course, from say, Democritus and his perceptual theory about emanations and the eidolon, Aristotle giving us laws of association to explain learning, Avicenna expanding on that to talk more about the blank slate and his kind of early cognitive psychology, talking about the different kinds of the sensory store and the common store, the common sense. The retentive imagination is something like an early short-term memory concept, for example. And then fast forward up to the British empiricists, we get Locke's theory of ideas as another sort of thing that results from uh, taking this empiricist point of view. But we also have lots of rationalist points of view as well that we need to talk about. So the goal here is not to tell you what to study for the exam or what's on the exam, because I have a lot of questions in there that's going to generate a different random exam for every student. So I can't really tell you what to expect other than everything covered in the readings and in the recorded lectures that I've linked out to YouTube is all fair game for the exam. So you really want to study everything. Make sure you also, I have emphasized many times in my announcements, go back to the modules where each chapter has a page that lists some key terms and learning objectives, and review each one of those. Ideally, write a couple of sentences about each learning objective. Also use those study questions that go with each chapter. And my recommendation is always that you will try to write your own answer to those questions before you look at my suggested sample answer. And if you do that, you're testing yourself, and then you can compare your answer to mine and see if you were in the ballpark there. Anyway, for the actual exam, the exam will be taken in 2 parts, right? So there's a multiple choice part with 30 multiple choice questions. Consult the syllabus for the timer on that. And same goes for the essay questions. These are fairly straightforward. There's going to be a very specific question, and you have to write out an answer to that question, a direct answer to the question. No extra stuff, just directly answer the question. But keep in mind that these questions may have multiple parts to them. It may be 2 to 3 questions that are embedded together, and you need to make sure that you address each part of the question in your response. It also has a timer. Also, be sure that you have installed the Respondus lockdown browser. I posted an announcement a few days ago for you to take a technology check quiz that just doesn't count for anything. It's just a way of it requires the lockdown browser. So to make sure that that is working correctly on your device, whether it's a computer or a tablet or phone, there should be versions that work for each one of those. There might be some issues with some Apple devices. I know that was the case last year. Not quite sure if that's still the issue. But anyway, make sure that that's working. And if you have any concerns with the technology, I also put some links to the Center for Distributed Learning as well as UCFIT into my announcement. Obviously, you can let me know as well, but I can't do a lot of the technical support for you, but they can fix those issues, generally speaking. Right. So anyway, let's get into the actual content of our exam review. And first, as I had said, we had started talking about different metaphysical views. So I just have an outline here of a list of some of those metaphysical views. And by the way, the actual outline that I made, the Unit 1 outline that's in the module, is also meant to provide a similar sort of kind of broad, higher view of the different ideas and how we might fit them together. So anyway, we had here different kinds of metaphysical views. I just defined metaphysics as all these different theories about, what's the true nature of the world? What's the true nature of reality? What's really out there? And we have Democritus and his theory of atoms. We have Heraclitus and his theory that change is the definition of reality, or change is the essence of reality. In contrast, Parmenides was the one who said that no, nothing changes. Everything remains the same. That's what I mean by status here, right? Everything is in constant status, right? There's no change ever. And so his view of the universe is this eternal, unchanging, perfect sphere. So that also means that motion and distance could not exist because motion, of course, is a form of change, and that could not be possible in his view. But also because he believes that the universe is just the one. The idea of multiplicity, of having more than one thing, is also, in violation of his view. And so motion can only be described as going from one place to another. But if you are subscribing to Parmenides' view, there's only one place, right? And so you can't go to some other place. There's no other place to go to. So movement, distance, those concepts are illogical. And so at the bottom, I'm asking that, right? What are the implications of these various metaphysics for whether we trust the senses? And thus also for then epistemology about human knowledge. So for Parmenides, it may seem clear that we can't trust the senses because his definition of reality as this perfect, eternal, unchanging sphere, just this singularity, seems to be completely at odds with our perceptual reality, where we see many things and we see distance and change and motion. So one of these things must be true and the other must be untrue. And of course, he believes that his view of the universe is true, and therefore it would be perceptual reality, the senses. That is what is untrue. And the implication for epistemology, remember, epistemology is essentially boiling down to rationalism versus empiricism. And if we're not going to trust the senses, I guess we would not want to suggest that there was any way in which we could obtain useful knowledge about reality through the senses. So this is going to take him towards a more rationalist view that true knowledge can only be obtained by inner knowledge, our human reason and logic. And that's really the only place for us to look for knowledge. In contrast, for Heraclitus, suggesting that if the universe is changing and change is the definition of reality, then we're going to have a different situation where now perceptual reality might in fact be more closer to the way things really are. And that opens up the possibility of trusting the senses. But as we also saw with Heraclitus, he argued that while it's true that knowledge can come from the senses, we still have to have the need for reason to help us interpret what we are seeing. Democritus, on the other hand, gave us this idea that everything made out of atoms, and the mind is made out of mind atoms, and that can interact with other kinds of atoms. And that perception works because those other kinds of atoms out there in the physical world emit these images of themselves called the idola, and that directly results in the motion of mind atoms. Well, that's a perceptual theory, so of course that would be an empiricist theory, right? So we seem to have this idea that when we adopt different metaphysical views about reality, we trace this out, and it seems to have implications for human knowledge and sensation and perception. So then, speaking of epistemology and that rationalism versus empiricism debate, we have different examples here, right? So the common theme under rationalism was this idea of um, say for Pythagoras, not just what we covered with Parmenides, but also under Pythagoras, making this claim that we are able to know ideas of perfection, right? We are able to understand mathematical and geometric ideals. And the claim, of course, is that we cannot obtain this through the senses. So that kind of higher perfection can only be understood by inner reason. Plato, very much in agreement, then provided an extra level of explanation for this, which is that the mind, before we are born, acquires all of this perfect knowledge because it lives in the ethereal realm of the forms. And then our soul being born into our physical body forgets all of that, but is gradually reminded after encountering all of these imperfect manifestations in the physical realm. And then we remember those forms gradually. And so his theory of knowledge is called the reminiscence theory because it's about remembering what we knew before we were born. So very much a strong version of rationalism there. Common theme was not trusting the senses. Down at the bottom, we have an idea here that, all these various little stories. Zeno was a student of Parmenides who gave us a variety of different paradoxes. There was the dichotomy paradox. There was also the story of Achilles racing the tortoise. And the millet seed story, all examples Zeno was using or attempting to use to suggest we could not trust the senses. Plato gives us the parable of the cave, suggesting that, again, maybe perception is just like looking at these distorted shadows on the cave wall, so we can't trust it. Descartes, further down the line in chapter 4, also says, hey, look, how do we know we're not just a brain in a vat instead of a brain in a body? And maybe, again, we would never know the difference between those two things because sensory information by itself is not enough to tell us the truth about that. And so, again, limits to what sensation and perception can tell us about what's really going on out there in the world, pointing to the idea that maybe we need something else, like, again, innate knowledge and or reason. Hence, of course, all of these stories would support a rationalist view. The different approaches that give us empiricism and different examples of empiricism. Again, we had Democritus and his theory of atoms and the idola as his perceptual theory. Aristotle also argued for the blank slate and argued for a more bottom-up theory of knowledge, starting with inductive logic of observing particular instances, and then understanding the rules and patterns that govern reality, sort of a very early kind of science even. And then jumping ahead to chapter 5, we get a lot of the empiricism finally showing up in a stronger statement of empiricism with people like Locke, who used the blank slate or white paper metaphor. Berkeley, Hume, are all empiricists, right? Hume, in a way, if I previously described Plato as the epitome of Greek rationalism, Hume, one could argue, is the epitome of British empiricism. So, of course, the common theme of the empiricists, especially coming from Locke's theory of ideas, is the principle of associationism. How does learning work? Locke says that knowledge begins with simple ideas, which have properties that are kind of like the secondary qualities that Galileo had talked about. So see chapter 3 there. And then all knowledge is built up in a bottom-up way. So again, bottom-up coming from Aristotle, and that bottom-up versus top-down that we use in modern cognitive psychology very much aligns to the rationalism empiricism debate. Empiricism is very much a bottom-up view. We just start by taking in the simple ideas, and we use that to build up into more complex ideas. And so you can also consult not just Locke's theory of ideas, but James Mill and John Stuart Mill and Alexander Bain on that particular topic. Whereas the Greek rationalist, you have to be born with that knowledge. It has to come first. And then having that knowledge inside of you is what helps you make sense out of reality. And that's a very top-down view that you need something that pre-exists your sensory experience. And that would be, for Plato, the innate knowledge from the realm of the forms. We might also see here that the associationistic empiricism of chapter 5 leads to nominalism. So that's that other point under empiricism, British empiricism here. The idea, of course, is that the concepts, right, understanding concepts like circularity and dog and things like that, are just the associations that are formed between various complex ideas. Hence, we end up with this British empiricist theme of bottom-up processing leading to the concepts, but those concepts are really just things that we have connected the dots here, right? We have just simply created concepts, complex ideas, and then associated them with each other to form these relationships in the mind and given names to those relationships. But that's all that they are. There's no, doesn't necessarily entail that those categories that we tend to think about in our minds actually have any relationship to something that is real, right? And so under the problem of universals, that's the realism versus nominalism debate. Do the concepts and categories of the human mind correspond to some external reality, or are they just ideas and maybe what we might call a social construct, right? We have all agreed we're going to categorize the world the way that we do, and we can share these names with each other so that we can all talk about these ideas, but they're not necessarily something that might be objectively physically real. Speaking again about things that are real, this is where we also end up in the mind-body concern here. So how do we define mind, and is it the same as the body? Is there just one kind of substance in the world? And if that's the case, we're talking about monism, or do mind and body remain distinct as if maybe there are two kinds of substances in the world, and then we would be talking about dualism. So if we're going to have just one kind of substance in the world, it has to be either a mental substance, ideas, thought, and that kind of stuff, or it has to be a material substance, matter, solid physical matter, and that's materialism. So examples of materialism, again, Democritus and his atoms. In chapter 5, Hobbes and Hartley tried to talk about motions in the brain, or for Hartley specifically, vibrations in the brain. Very similar, related ideas, just subtle differences there in the underlying metaphors they're using. We also had another ism for Hobbes, though, because he does leave open the possibility that there might be something about the nature of mental experience that's a little different than these motions in the brain. And his claim is that these motions in the brain create mental experience as some sort of an accidental side effect. But that mind as a side effect of what the brain is doing doesn't really control the brain or body. It doesn't actually have any causal impact here. So we don't have to solve the mind-body problem by treating the mind as an epiphenomenon, right? That's what I mean by the side effect of what the brain is doing. It's an epiphenomenon. And therefore, in a way, it's just kind of minimalized and pushed off into the corner and say, that's just some weird little thing that happens when the brain does what it does. We have experiences and we can't explain it, and we don't really need to explain it because it really doesn't play a role in what the brain is doing. What exactly does play a role in what the brain is doing? And that's, of course, its interaction with the world. And sensations come in from the outside world, and that's what causes motions, or if you're Hartley, vibrations in the brain. And those motions or vibrations in the brain, that is thought, and it's purely the result of external sensory input, right? Not the result of any mental process, right? So in that situation, we would see that not only are they materialists, but all three of those guys under materialism were also labeled as empiricists as well. So it's an interesting parallel that we find, that kind of a metaphysical view here of eliminating mental stuff and focusing more on material substance also tends to lead to empiricism. Conversely, with Berkeley, obviously he was the weird one, right? He was the one who had mentioned to be is to be perceived. And so perception is reality. There is no separate reality outside of how it is perceived. And therefore, there's no reality outside of thought. So he is an idealist in that regard. Of course, that makes him strongly an empiricist as well, because perception is reality, and that's it, right? And that's all that there is. And that might also be obvious, perhaps, that he is ultimately the ultimate nominalist here as well, because The question is there anything about the ideas that we have that exist independent of our perception of them? And Berkeley is saying there is nothing that exists independent of our perception of it, right? Under dualism, though, this is the claim that mind and body exist. Now, the question is if they interact with each other, we're faced with the mind-body interaction problem. That was exactly what Descartes had tried to solve, which we covered in chapter 4. But we saw that Descartes fails really to do that, right? He defines the stuff of mind and the stuff of body in his particular way, and then tries to come up with his hand-wavy idea of the mind somehow being localized in the pineal gland, where it's allowed to make these tiny movements to trigger the motion of the animal spirits throughout the nerves. But that definition of that way of treating the mind violates his definition of mind, right? By giving it a position in space and giving it the ability to move and so forth. Suddenly it sounds a lot more like a material mind, but he's trying to explain it more in terms of an ethereal, ghostly kind of mind. I put Locke here as well. He didn't really try to solve mind-body interactionism, but it's important to realize that when Locke was kind of inheriting that Galilean distinction of primary, secondary qualities, and that he is being a dualist there. And I think it's fair to categorize him as an interactionist because he is claiming that the physical world does create ideas in the mind, and that the mind can somehow react to that and cause the body to do things. He just doesn't really address that specific issue. He's much more focused on epistemological theories about it, the empiricism. Meanwhile, of course, since Descartes had failed to successfully explain mind-body interaction, we could try to hold on to dualism, but then just claim that there is no interaction and find some other kind of more complicated explanation for how the mind and body might somehow just be working in parallel with each other, sort of able to do their own thing in perfect synchrony with each other. And so we saw also in chapter 4 how Spinoza and Leibniz had their own interesting, I guess, unique ways of explaining how that's going to work. So connections between mind-body problem and epistemology, well, noticing, of course, the trend, as I had said earlier, everyone under monism is an empiricist, right? Especially those materialists. Berkeley, of course, clearly an empiricist too. Everyone under dualism, well, Locke threw a wrench into it, but Descartes was a rationalist. I think it's fair to call Spinoza and Leibniz a rationalist. And if we could look back at the Greeks, even though when we talk about people like Parmenides and Plato and Pythagoras too, I guess, they were not really directly addressing mind-body issues, but there is something that we might call an implicit dualism in what they're talking about, because they do sort of implicitly suggest that there's something about external reality that's fundamentally different from our internal mental reality. And as I've said many times, anytime a philosopher is suggesting, or a psychologist even, that there is a difference between perception and reality, what's in here, pointing to my head. I know I don't have my webcam working today, so you can't see me, but pointing to my head saying what's in here versus what's out there is a form of dualism. We might call it, like I said, implicit dualism. They're not specifically, as Descartes did, defining mind and body in these distinct terms, but they are implying that there is a difference between mind and physical body and reality. So whenever we have that implication, we want to identify that as a form of dualism. That's what primary and secondary qualities is all about, right? There is an implied dualism going on there. Okay. We don't have a whole lot to say about this one, but what we saw is that there were a few of these ideas that seem to also lead us down the path towards determinism. I think a lot of this began with Democritus and suggesting that the mind atoms only move when they are impacted by other atoms or idola. They don't get to move on their own. So that would seem to suggest that if the mind is a physical thing, it has to obey the laws of physics. I think it's also fair to say that that would be equivalent for Hobbes and Hartley in chapter 5, because they wanted to materialize. So we see them all under the same, coming back here, under that same materialist heading here. And so there's a theme that materialism took us not just to empiricism, but it also took us to determinism, right? The mind has to follow the laws of physics. depending on what your level of physics is, right? So for Democritus, he had that very, very simple and naive theory of atoms. By the time we get to Hobbes and Hartley, we have a much more advanced physics coming from Isaac Newton. So, and of course, Newton gave us laws of motion, and Hobbes is appealing to those by talking about the mind as motion in the brain, right? Now, implications for a science of psychology, that's just something that I may have briefly talked about in chapter 2, or maybe just chapter 1. I don't remember now. Sorry. But the idea is that if we're trying to predict human behavior, then that would seem to suggest that we're only going to be successful at predicting behavior when we are able to successfully um, identify the laws that govern it. And if there are laws to be discovered that govern human behavior, then that might seem to chip away a little bit at free will. Conversely, of course, for all of the mind-body dualists, that would, especially Descartes, that would seem to exempt the mind from the laws of physics and allow it to do its own thing. And so, of course, that's another implication there related to the mind-body issue here. Now, I mentioned a few times already the nominalism versus realism debate, so I have a lot of examples under here. Under nominalism, I've already talked about the associationists of chapter 5, Locke and James Mill and John Stuart Mill and Bain, but even Hume and Berkeley, I had suggested, were also nominalists because they were claiming that there's not much we can say about what's going on independent, right? If you're Berkeley, there's literally nothing independent of perception. For Hume, the skeptic, we really can't make any claims to knowledge about something that would exist separate from perception. But in addition to that, Occam's razor, so that was raised in chapter 3, the idea that we don't want to multiply entities beyond necessity. And so talking about some external reality, especially Platonic ethereal realm, as a way of invoking realism to think that these universal concepts, like not just circularity and dog, but also broader things like truth, beauty, justice, piety, those big universals, do they exist as specialized forms in this ethereal realm that get to have their own independent existence? William of Ockham says that's not necessary to explain how we come to know such ideas, and so he shaves them off of his theory, right? Under realism, I was just describing Plato as what we call exaggerated realism. I recently heard somebody call it capital R realism. It's just this very strong statement that those universals do get their own special independent reality in that ethereal realm. But what we saw in chapter 3 was that there's another form that we might call moderate realism. Also, I referred to it a few times as Thomistic realism because it is named after St. Thomas Aquinas. But this is the idea that we can say that these concepts are real, but they have a physical reality that is inseparable from the objects of our experience, not existing in some special ethereal realm like Plato has suggested. So the claim here is that when trying to define what makes a dog, we would say that every individual dog we encounter may have particular qualities that makes it unique, and those are easy to identify. And even though it's difficult for us to point to what the essential qualities are that defines its dogness, right? Aquinas argues that it nevertheless has to have such qualities because if it didn't, we would not be able to recognize it as being a dog. And so whatever serves as the basis of our recognition, that would be the essential quality that thing has that enables me to recognize a circle when I see a circle, and a dog when I see a dog, and a chair when I see a chair. So again, chairs come in different kinds of shapes and forms as well, right? But we still are able to know a chair when we see it because it has its unique design, which makes it particular, but it also has some essence that we say, yeah, I can tell that that's clearly a chair. And that's what Aquinas is saying. We can't really separate these two things, but of course they have to both be there. Galileo makes a further distinction here by suggesting that there are things out there in the world that have their own unique qualities that are rendered into our perception in a way that's different than the way they exist in reality. And so these are the secondary qualities. So the primary qualities define the real things. The secondary qualities are somehow related to primary qualities, but are not quite the same. So color is our usual go-to example here, right? The claim is that uh, uh, pigments painted onto a surface will absorb and reflect various wavelengths of light, but the pigments themselves are just chemicals. They don't have a color. And likewise, the light reflecting from that object does not have a color. That was Isaac Newton's research with prisms. But for Galileo, his claim is that it doesn't really become the concept of color, the experience of color, like red or blue or green, until it enters into the mind and the primary qualities of the light rays become secondary qualities of color. We can make a similar argument about sound, right? The idea is that sounds are just vibrations that can vary in their amplitude and their frequency, but in the mind it becomes ideas of loudness and pitch and musical qualities, for example, right? And so those unique qualities that make music sound the way it does is something secondary to the physical description of the sound waves themselves. So can we know if there isn't such a reality? Well, I have already mentioned Hume a little bit, so we want to maybe get a little more in detail here of Hume's skeptical argument, right? His claim was that there's nothing that we can know that it's not first given to the senses. That's the core claim for Hume. And so that means we can only know what is given to the senses. And so his argument is that there's lots of things that we might talk about as ideas, but when we really analyze that, we would realize that they are not given to the senses. Think about this when we think about your very first discussion post, for example. And so causality is one of the main ones that he talks about, that when I see one thing move and collide with a second thing and the second thing moves, we tend to believe that the first thing caused the second thing to move. And certainly that's part of Newtonian physics, even, that this works this way. But his argument is that there's no way for us to know that, because the actual causal force transmitted from one object to another is not actually something that we can see or is given to any of our five senses. All that we really can see is that the motion of the first was followed by the motion of the second. And his claim, of course, it's nothing but a mental habit equivalent to an association, that we believe that the first caused the second, but we can't know that. Of course, this is also the usual proverb about correlation not proving causation, right? All that we can see and experience are the various correlations between events in the world around us. But if we believe that any one event causes another one, we have conflated correlation with causation. And his claim is that that is not justified. And we can't really truly know such things as a result. So that leaves Hume giving us a skeptical view of human knowledge, that many of the things that we think that we know are simply just beliefs that we have formed based on habits and associations where we have, as I said, conflated correlation with causation. Reid appeals to common sense here, claiming that when we are aware of things, we are not just forming ideas in the mind and correlating or associating them, but what we are really doing is we are perceiving an objective reality. It is only common sense that we are perceiving an objective reality. And so he would claim that we really do know what's going on out there. This idea that we can establish an objective reality through observation, especially by having multiple people share in their observations and agree on those observations, then serves as a basis for defining scientific approaches to studying reality, and that's positivism. And so we start to define in more formal terms how to distinguish science as an empiricist enterprise through objective observation, not importantly subjective observation where only one person can see it. That's not good enough, right? You have to have replication, you have to have agreement. And so connections to rationalism and empiricism at the bottom. Well, we might notice that a lot of our nominalists were empiricists, right? The associationists of chapter 5, Hume, Berkeley, and so forth. The realists, on the other hand, tended to be the Greeks. So Plato, for example, being like I said, the capital R, exaggerated realism here. And Aquinas and Galileo may have been somewhere in there as well. Hard to say, but certainly one of the claims here is that the Greek rationalists tended to believe that there was a true reality separate from our perceptual reality, And the only way for us to know it was through reason. So there tends to be this little connection, especially in these early philosophies, between rationalism and realism, and then likewise between empiricism and nominalism. But it's not a hard and fast rule. I want to emphasize that realism and rationalism do not mean the same thing, and nominalism and empiricism do not mean the same thing. And even though there tends to be some connection or correlation between nominalism and empiricism, and likewise between realism and rationalism, it's not a hard rule. There are plenty of exceptions to that. But understanding why those patterns exist, right? That's one thing to see here, one thing to notice. And that, as they say, is that. So we'll stop the recording.